Hello again. This is another episode of In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder, and I am very happy today because we have the lovely Sophie Osborn here to talk about her work as well as her new book. But before we go any further, I must give props to our sponsors. Cower Sporting Optics, the manufacturer of the world-renowned Promenade series of spotting scopes, and as well as Birds, Wildlife and Nature Tours, the tour company that strives to deliver the best of birding and wildlife opportunities throughout the world. So thank you guys for sponsoring us. Um, I would like to welcome Sophie to our screen. So before I do, let me just say that if you are watching this in the future on YouTube, you know what to do. Like and subscribe. Tell everyone about In Conservation. We've got so many different conversations on In Conservation on the YouTube channel, which you should know because you're on it. But if you don't know, it is the Urban Birder channel. And even tell people you don't like, because maybe they might come around and become nice people afterwards. All right. Sophie, good day. Good day to you, should I say? And where are you and how are you?
I, I'm doing well, thank you. And I'm in Montana, so Rocky Mountain country in the US, about hours behind you, I think. So it's midday, sunny with our first big snowfall.
Wow. Montana, I've never been there, but I think I might have been there in a previous life seriously, when I was a puma. I think I think I hung out in the Rocky Mountains, but
It's it,
I'll have, I'll
it's
have
a
to do
nice place to hang out.
I'll have to do more work on working out actually what happened when I was there. Anyway, just before Sophie and I have a quick chat, let me just tell you about Sophie because you may not know her straight away. Sophie Osborn is an author, and actually her new book, Feather Trails: A Journey of Discovery among endangered birds, is what we're talking about today, and it's what drew me to her because I saw that book online. And I thought, wow, this looks really interesting. Um, and it is interesting, and it's a great book, by the way. She's a wildlife biologist whose work has included the study and conservation of more than a dozen bird species in the Americas and small mammal research in the back country of Grand Canyon National Park. What is the back country? Is that like the places that people don't go to?
Yes, exactly. The remote places that most people don't get to. The front country is the more populated where the buses unload and all the tourists are, and the back country is the parts of the canyon that you have to work to get to by hiking usually.
Okay. You have contributed to reintroduction efforts for several endangered birds and served as a field manager for the California Condor Recovery Program in Arizona for nearly 4 years. You've got a couple of other books, haven't you, including Condors in Canyon Country, which won the 2007 National Outdoor Book Award for Nature and the Environment, which is fantastic.
Thank you.
And your writings have also been published in Birdwatching, which I presume is a US magazine,
US version, yep.
uh, Wyoming Wildlife and Sojourns magazine. So, I don't have any old guests on In Conservation With. They're all proper high caliber people. And so certainly one of them. Um, how did you, because I've kind of did some research and I couldn't find that much on you because you're not a social media denizen. So how did you kind of come to be so fascinated with wildlife and nature?
I came to it much more slowly than some people do. I'm envious of your background. I mean, you were into birds practically an hour after you were born, I think, but I discovered it late. I loved animals and I was a rural living person. I grew up in Switzerland and then in Vermont. But I had no idea what I could do with my love for wildlife. And So I went to college and did other things. I also loved traveling and languages. So I thought maybe I wanted to be a diplomat or something. But I really just loved wildlife and wished there was something out there that I could do. And I had no idea that wildlife biologists existed. When I was working in Washington, D.C. after college, I suddenly came across a catalog that was by a group called the School for Field Studies, and they offer classes all over the world in ecology and, lo and behold, wildlife biology. And I was looking in it, and they had this wildlife biology course in Africa, and I started reading descriptions of the classes, and I was blown away because I thought, this is what I want to be doing. I thought my only other option was to be a vet if I loved animals, and I had tried being a vet tech, and I just didn't want to be inside a vet's office all my life. But when I saw this catalog, I realized this is what I want to be doing. So I was in DC, Washington, DC, and I was working as a bike messenger for the summer. And I took a biology class because I needed that as a prerequisite, and then got a scholarship and headed to Africa for 4 months. And being in Africa and living what I was learning about, ecology and animals and how we manage them really sold me on it. And so I had to go back to school to make up some coursework because I didn't have a biology background. And my first summer of field work, I happened to see an advertisement for reintroducing peregrine falcons in Wyoming. And so I managed to get that job and went out and reintroduced peregrine falcons for the summer. And watching those birds fly around just captivated me. It was the most incredible summer. It was transformational. And it made me realize that I wanted to dedicate my career to helping birds. So it was a long way to get there, but no less passionate for having taken a little bit of time to figure it all out.
And would you call yourself a birder, or are you more of an ecologist, naturalist, ecologist even, should I say?
I think I'm both. I'm not a birder with your skills and intensity, but I love looking at birds. I love seeing new birds. I love going to new countries, and I keep a bird list, but I'm not obsessive about it. I keep it more as sort of a diary for where I've been and what I've been doing. But I do love birds, and I love birding as well as being fascinated with ecology and animal behavior. I love.
Yeah. And out of interest, you mentioned earlier about your languages. How many languages can you speak?
Not tons, but I grew up speaking French. I'm a little rusty on that. And then I speak some Spanish because I worked a lot in Latin America. I worked in Peru and Argentina, Guatemala, and then I've traveled a lot in Central and South America. So I'm pretty comfortable speaking Spanish.
In that case, you need to come to Spain.
I know, I would love to because I grew up partly in Switzerland until I was 9 years old, but most of my memories and experiences were as a child, and I'm dying to get back to Europe as an adult so I can see the birds, among other things.
That's,
So
that's fantastic. All
you
right.
may have an unwanted visitor on your Spanish doorstep sometime.
Never unwanted, Sophie. Never. Listen, why don't I know you got a little presentation lined up. Let's have a look at that because it'd be really interesting to learn more about your work and also how, it tied into the book, Feather Trails.
That sounds good. That sounds good. Let me share my screen. Um,
Yeah. So looking forward to learning more about
how's
this
that?
this amazing journey. I got the whole screen here. So yeah.
Okay. So I think I'm ready to go then.
You're good to
Okay,
go.
thanks everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to hear about conserving endangered birds. As David said, my new book, Feather Trails: A Journey of Discovery Among Endangered Birds, describes my journey into the amazing world of birds. The book is in part a personal story about becoming and being a wildlife biologist. It takes you behind the scenes and it shows you what it's like day to day to reintroduce captive raised birds to the wild in order to save three endangered species: peregrine falcon, Hawaiian crow, and California condors. And in the process, the book illuminates the threats that imperil these and other birds. In the early 1900s, miners began taking canaries into the coal mines because the birds were highly sensitive to carbon monoxide. And if the birds keeled over, it meant the air had become unsafe. Today, our wild birds are the canaries in the coal mine that alert us to environmental harms through their declining populations or their failure to thrive. And we've learned over time that what harms birds often harms us too. The peregrine falcon is a top-level predator that feeds mainly on birds, and it lives in a wide variety of habitats on every continent except Antarctica. The bird nests on ledges, on cliffs, buildings, and structures like bridges. And remarkably, it's adapted incredibly well to living in some of our biggest cities like London and New York. Today, peregrines are widespread, but years ago, beginning in the 1950s, they began disappearing at an alarming rate. Their disappearance was first confirmed by a British biologist named Derek Ratcliffe, who completed peregrine surveys in England in 1962. By the mid-1960s, peregrine declines were being reported from all over the world, 36 countries on 5 continents, and biologists were soon calling the collapse of peregrine populations an ecological disaster. After years of investigation, scientists finally figured out that it was pesticides, and especially a new one known as DDT, that had caused peregrine populations to crash. DDT had been used very successfully in World War II to control insect-borne diseases, and it had come into widespread use after the war to combat agricultural and forest insect pests. By feeding on birds that had ingested DDT, peregrines accumulated large amounts of the pesticides in their bodies, and this affected their calcium production. As a result, they laid thin-shelled eggs that broke during incubation, so they weren't able to successfully raise any young. In addition to studying DDT, biologists also figured out how to breed peregrines in captivity so that they could reintroduce the birds to the wild to help recover the species. I joined this reintroduction effort in 1991 when I headed to the state of Wyoming, another Rocky Mountain state, neighboring state to where I am now, for my first work as a field biologist, releasing captive peregrines to the wild. And I'd only camped a few times when my field partner and I found ourselves living out of a tent in grizzly bear country near Yellowstone National Park. We were responsible for monitoring and feeding 5 captive reared falcons that had been brought to our release site and placed in a large plywood box known as a hat box. And on release day, our supervisor removed the front of the box so that the birds could fly free. Over the next 6 weeks, my field partner and I monitored the birds from dawn to dusk. We put out food for them each day, and we hazed away potential predators with noisemakers. And I detail our adventures and my initiation as a biologist in feather trails. Over time, peregrine reintroductions like mine, which occurred all over North America, were wildly successful. But what really allowed the peregrine falcon to recover was the banning of DDT in 1972. Unfortunately, though, rather than learn from the lessons that peregrines and other birds taught us, today we're experiencing a similar type of environmental catastrophe with a new class of pesticides known as neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. Neonics are less acutely toxic to birds than DDT was, but these pesticides are far, far more toxic to insects, and their widespread use has contributed to what many have dubbed an insect apocalypse. We're currently experiencing an ecologically catastrophic disappearance of insects. Because so many of our birds feed on insects, this has profound implications for our bird life. And because peregrines feed on birds, insect declines are likely to impact peregrines too. For the time being, though, peregrine populations are doing well. They've recovered really well since the DDT era, and the falcon was removed from the US endangered species list in 1999. And the peregrine's global comeback is one of our greatest conservation success stories. Unfortunately, things haven't gone as well for the second species that I write about, the Hawaiian crow, or alala, as it's known in Hawaii. Most people are astonished to hear that any crow anywhere is endangered, but crows that live on islands, and especially those that depend on forested habitats, are some of our most endangered birds. The Hawaiian crow is the most endangered corvid in the world. Corvids are members of the crow, raven, and jay family. It occurs only on the island of Hawaii, which is known as the Big Island, where it resides in the cloud forest. A good portion of the alala's forest habitat in Hawaii was destroyed first by Polynesian and then by European colonizers and the animals that they brought with them. The Hawaiian birds evolved on islands that had no mammals except for bats and no reptiles. So their only native predator was the Hawaiian hawk, or the eo, as it's known in Hawaii. But people introduced rats and mongooses and domestic cats, all of which prey on Hawaiian birds that never evolved to cope with these kinds of predators. Outdoor cats, both feral and domestic, pose an additional danger because they carry and transmit diseases. Toxoplasmosis is a cat-transmitted disease that's dangerous to wildlife and to people. It's killed several alala and at least a dozen endangered Hawaiian monk seals. Worldwide, it's one of the most common human parasitic infections, and evidence suggests that the disease may be associated with a variety of mental disorders, including depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia. You can get this disease by eating contaminated vegetables or undercooked meat, by cleaning your cat's litter box if you have an outdoor cat, or even by weeding a garden that's visited by cats. Hawaii's birds have also been decimated by mosquito-borne diseases. Mosquitoes were introduced to the islands in 1826, and they transmitted avian malaria and avian pox, which were two introduced diseases that were fatal to many of Hawaii's birds. Most of the native birds that now remain in Hawaii live at higher elevations where it's cooler and there are fewer mosquitoes. But in our warming climate, mosquitoes are able to thrive at higher elevations, and soon there's going to be no mosquito-free habitat left for Hawaii's birds. When I worked on the Hawaiian Crow Recovery Project in the early 1990s, there were only 12 wild alala left. My job was to safeguard the first 5 captive reared alala to be released to the wild. Once the nestling crows were transferred to the release site, they were placed in a hack box, which is the upper wooden portion of the facility you're looking at, for several weeks, and then they were released into an attached aviary. And then after spending about a month in the aviary, they were released to the wild. Along with a field partner, I was tasked with tracking the crows through the cloud forest, monitoring their behavior, and providing them with supplemental food until they were able to feed on their own. The alala were remarkable. Aside from being very vocal, they were funny, playful, and just incredibly engaging. They're also really intelligent. They're one of the few birds species that can use tools to secure difficult to reach food items. But my favorite thing about the alala was the bird's extraordinary voice. The crow has more than 60 different types of calls, and to me, it's truly the voice of the Hawaiian cloud forest. Today, though, despite years of effort and numerous reintroductions, Hawaii's forests are silent and the crows exist only in captivity. Plans, though, are now underway for reintroducing crows to the island of Maui, where the Hawaiian hawk doesn't occur, because surprisingly, these predators took an unexpected toll on reintroduced crows. In addition, a biocontrol is now being used to try to reduce mosquito numbers. So there's still hope for the captivating alala, and I hope people will read about it and come to learn about it, because the bird's future now depends entirely on us. The California Condor story is much better known, at least on the US side of the pond. I don't know where all the people tuning in are from, but this is the third species that I write about in Feather Trails. The California Condor is a member of the New vulture family, and it's the largest land bird in North America with a wingspan of about 9.5 feet. And you can appreciate its size more when you see it flying with this common raven. Condors declined precipitously during the 1800s and 1900s, and biologists weren't exactly sure why. But when they conducted the first full population count in 1982, they were shocked to discover that there were only 22 condors left in existence, 21 in captivity, 21 in the wild and one in captivity. It wasn't until biologists started tracking condors that they'd outfitted with radio transmitters on their wings that they discovered several condors that had died of lead poisoning after ingesting lead ammunition fragments that they'd found in the carcasses that they had fed on. But it was years before biologists realized that when lead bullets are shot into an animal, they lose about 30% of their mass and fragment into tiny particles, which are then inadvertently consumed by whatever feeds on that animal. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, condors were disappearing fast. So the US Fish and Wildlife Service decided to capture the last few wild birds that were left to keep them safe and to bolster a captive breeding program. Fortunately, captive breeding, which was initiated in 1982, was very successful. And captive bred condors were reintroduced first in California in 1992, and then in Arizona at the Vermilion Cliffs, which are just north of the Grand Canyon, in 1996. I joined the Condor Recovery Program as the field manager for the Arizona reintroduction effort in 2000. And in addition to releasing condors in the wild into the wild, my job was to monitor the birds and keep them safe. We taught newly released condors to roost in places that were safe from predators like coyotes, and we taught them to stay away from people by harassing them if they perched in inappropriate places, like on roofs looking into windows. But the most critical aspect of my job was keeping condors alive, since they were at constant risk from ingesting lead ammunition in the carcasses that they found. Lead ammunition is the single greatest threat to condors. And to be clear, it's not a hunting issue. Hunting is actually very helpful to condors because it provides them with so much food on the landscape. Instead, it's solely an ammunition issue. If it weren't for lead ammunition, condors would be thriving. The black and white specks in these x-rays of shot animals are lead fragments. And so you can see how scavengers like condors, eagles, and ravens that feed on carcasses like these would ingest small particles of lead, which were enough to poison them. So what about people who eat hunter-killed game meat? Are they vulnerable as well? To investigate this, a North Dakota doctor x-rayed 100 packages of venison that had been donated to local food banks in 2007. 59% of the packages that he x-rayed contained lead fragments. And this is a photo of some of those packages. The little white flecks are bits of lead. Other states then x-rayed their venison donations to food banks, and they also found alarming lead levels. But despite these findings years ago, food bank donations of hunter-killed game meat are still unregulated in the US, and hunters continue to eat lead-filled meat and feed it to their families. And this could be having profoundly negative health and societal outcomes. No level of lead is considered safe for people, and toxic lead effects are largely irreversible. Non-lead bullets that don't fragment are now widely available, but there's still enormous resistance to using non-lead ammunition by hunters and by hunter advocacy groups like the National Rifle Association, or NRA, in the US. They claim that no one's ever been harmed by hunting with lead bullets, but medical doctors are very clear about the effects of lead ammunition, which can impact heart health, cause reproductive issues, and reduce longevity, to name just a few concerns. Despite the perils of lead, though, I had many adventures and high points during my work with condors, which I write about in detail in this book. In 2001, I was fortunate to document the first egg laid in the wild by reintroduced condors, which garnered international attention and made Discover Magazine's Top 100 Science Stories of 2001 list. I also had the good fortune of monitoring Arizona's very first condor chick. Despite the existential threat that lead ammunition poses to condors, reintroductions and intensive management have significantly bolstered the condor population, and there are now over 300 California condors flying free in North America. Thanks to the U.S. Endangered Species Act and thousands of dedicated people, these three incredible species are still with us today. And these birds have shown us that targeted conservation efforts really do work. We've had tremendous success recovering endangered species, but along the way, we've also come to appreciate that our best strategy is to keep common birds common and prevent them from becoming endangered in the first place. And that's where I think bird lovers like us can come in. There are tens of millions of us who enjoy birds. At last count in the US, 96 million people alone. And if we all do a few small things to help birds, we might be able to turn around their declining population numbers. For example, we can keep our cats indoors. We can put decals on our windows to prevent bird collisions, avoid using pesticides, and support our natural areas and bird conservation groups, just to name some of the more obvious ones. There are also countless other ways that we can help birds, and I try to provide suggestions whenever I write about birds, for example, on my blog. So those miners who use canaries in the coal mines to alert them to bad air, well, many of them became attached to those little birds and they didn't want them to die. So when the canaries struggled for air, the miners revived them with an oxygen tank. Famous conservationist Thomas Lovejoy said, quote, "If you take care of birds, you take care of most of the environmental problems in the world. By helping birds, we not only enrich our lives by supporting the bird life around us, but we're also likely to solve a variety of environmental problems and help a lot of other creatures that live on our planet as well, including us." So thanks to you for listening to this quick, speedy introduction. Thanks for everything that you're doing to help birds. And I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, that's fabulous. I mean, I loved your book, Feather Trails, Sophie.
I'm so glad.
I thought it was a really, I mean, I found it quite emotional actually. Um, I especially, I mean, we're going to sort of talk through some of the things anyway, but I just found it very, very touching. And I guess the most natural thing to do is to just talk about the three species you've featured in the book. And I guess in reverse order, seeing as that probably is the freshest at the moment. Um, the California Condor is a bird that, as a kid, I've always kind of wondered about in terms of, will I ever get to see one? Um, but I can't, the lead bullet thing. Um, in the UK, there's been a lot of, you know, remonstration about people using lead bullets. And the argument, the argument was that the lead bullets were better than any other type of bullet. And clearly that's not the case. But I never realized that in the US, I'm not sure if it's Canada as well, but certainly in the US, that the lead bullet thing was actually seemingly quite unregulated.
It really is unregulated. So, I mean, the fact that food bank donations are still unregulated, and when you check on websites of hunter groups that are donating their meat to food banks, none of them require their hunters to use non-lead, which is just seems crazy to me. Apparently, some states are now enacting some minimal screening protocols, but as far as I know, there's no official regulations, and they're still just doing what they were doing for all these years, which is it's quite appalling, really.
And what about the US Fish and Wildlife Service? So what's their stance on this?
You know, they have tried to enact regulations in the past, but they've been having to do it. I think they're swimming against a tide of very powerful entities, and they've done it in small degrees. For example, they were going to phase out the use of non-lead ammunition on our national wildlife refuges, which you would think is sort of a no-brainer. And the Obama administration had passed that, but that was one of the first things that the Trump administration that came in 2016 reversed. So we really see no headway on that front at all. So
And
the only state that has made progress with non-lead ammunition is California, which banned non-lead, lead ammunition beginning in 2019 for the sake of its condors. So that's the only state that's done that so far, which is a great start, but it's one state of many. I'm seeing more state game agencies ask their hunters to use non-lead ammunition for the sake of wildlife, but I never see them mention the human health threat, which is just shocking to me.
it's incredible. I mean, I'm sure people watching this in the future will hopefully have a better story for us. But given where we are now today, and given that there's going to be a new administration coming in very shortly, do you think the departments like the US Fish and Wildlife Service are going to be protected, or do you think they're going to be stripped back?
I think they're going to be stripped back. I think we're in for a rough time, except for those of us, who love wildlife and who are dedicated to helping it, standing up and doing what we can to hold the line. So, but given what we saw in the last Trump administration in terms of reversing some encouraging measures on neonicotinoid regulations and on lead ammunition regulations, to name two. I think we might be in for a rocky ride as far as the environment goes.
Yeah. Anyway, on to slightly more pleasant things. What do you think of my picture of my California Condor on my shoulder here?
I just love it. And I just, I hope that you get to see one on your visit to California because no matter how often I saw them, when you have one flying over you, it is just mind blowing. They really are so enormous and they're just absolutely beautiful in flight. They're incredible to watch. And some of the things, there's so much more to them than meets the eye. Some of the things I write about in my book that most people aren't aware of with California condors is how playful they are. They love punting water bottles down a beach with their bill. They love playing with toys, playing tug of war. Whenever I knew based on their radio signals, if there was a group of condors in an area, I knew that there was either a carcass or some really fun toys that they were playing with. So they're really a captivating species, and hopefully people who read the book get to hear how engaging they are. A lot of people look at them and think they're just a big ugly bird, but they have amazing personalities. And I really came to know the individuals. At the time, I had held every single condor in Arizona in my arms. I had worked with them. I knew every single bird, and they all have their own quirks and different personalities, and that just made it so much fun to work with them.
They must have been pretty big, pretty heavy, shall I say, because they look pretty big against you in those pictures.
They were very big compared to me, especially. So when I first handled one, I'd handled all sorts of birds and eagles, and from hummingbirds to eagles. And I felt like the California condor was the most challenging bird I'd ever handled, not so much for its size, but it has this powerful bill and a very snaky head with loose flesh on the head, so it's hard to grab hold of them. And their weapon is their bill, and they will just grab you and bite you if they can. And so I was definitely daunted and intimidated the first few times I'd handled them. But once I got comfortable with it, then it was like handling any other bird. You just had to control the dangerous bits. But I was glad I got so comfortable handling them, big as they are.
Were they, I mean, historically, were they ever common? I mean, what was their range historically before the dramatic decline?
They were much more widespread. I don't know how common they ever were, except maybe locally, but they were originally in the Pleistocene. They went from British Columbia down to Mexico and as far east as Florida and New York State. So pretty much throughout North America. I don't know how much in the interior of North America. We don't have records of them there. But their range contracted with the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, which was big animals like Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths and the like. And then they were restricted just to the western U.S., mainly in California, but there was always reports of them outside of California until the 1920s. And some of those reports took place in Arizona, especially in and around Grand Canyon. And they definitely were in Grand Canyon a lot in the Pleistocene because a lot of the caves have condor bones in them.
Wow. So, what do you think the future is for that species?
Well, one of the things I talk about in my book is how these different species have provided us with some instructive lessons about recovering endangered birds. And one of them was that if we can eliminate their main threat, our chance of recovering that bird is really good. And that's what happened with the peregrine. We eliminated DDT, and that really facilitated their recovery.
Do you
When we
not think,
don't
do you not think that eliminating their main threat is basically killing us?
Well, yes, but I'm not sure that we can get the public behind that one. So, so we have to settle for maybe I should call it the secondary threat. But in the case of condors, their main threat is lead ammunition, and because we haven't been able to eliminate that, it sort of undermined their recovery. So we've bolstered their numbers hugely. They're doing much, much better than they were, but they still require intensive management. And then the Hawaiian crow is an example of a bird that has a lot of complex challenges, and it's been a lot more complicated as a result to recover it. And funding hasn't been as good in Hawaii as it is for the mainland US and things like that. So anyway, those three species sort of provide a range of, what is most successful when we try to recover birds.
Before we get onto the alala, the California Condor, is it a bird that's easy to see? Are there kind of watch points where people can go to and see these birds, or are they all kind of secret?
No, they're very easy to see in certain areas. Like I could tell you less well in California because I'm not as familiar with the hot spots there. But in Arizona, I could tell you seasonally, we'll go to this spot in April or go to these places, in the winter or in the summer. And they're so social and they definitely have certain areas that they frequent more during parts of the year. So it's pretty easy to go and observe them in some of these places as long as you just touch base with somebody who can tell you where to go.
Okay, well, I'll bear that in mind when I come over in January. Um, the Hawaiian Crow or alala for me was the saddest, the most, the one that made me feel most emotional as a story, and you told it very eloquently. Um, it's a crow that I believe there was four other species of crow in the islands, wasn't there? And I think it's the only one that's left. Is that right?
Long ago, yes, yeah, yeah, but that's the only one that's left. So the others, we just have bones and fragments of them. So
And they had quite a mythical status amongst the native Hawaiians, the alala.
yes, they very much did. They were really important to the native peoples, their voice and their actions. So they were really important to them. And I think that's been a huge loss, having it be extinct in the wild. That's been kind of dislocating, I think, for some of the native peoples. And it's just been a big cultural loss for them. I mean, I tend to think of their loss in more ecological terms, like the forests have lost one of their major seed dispersers. That's my perspective. But for the native Hawaiians, it's been definitely a big cultural loss.
Yeah, and for people like me who are based in land masses way away from Hawaii, even though I have been to Hawaii before, and I was saying to you previously that it felt like a outdoor aviary. I mean, all the native birds were gone. I spent 2 weeks there. I was actually working on a commercial. Um,
Mhm.
I wasn't actually filming it myself, but I was assisting, and I was birding secretly whilst I was, supposed to be doing. And in 2 weeks, I saw 13 native species in 2 weeks. And I was looking, but I didn't get into the
Mhm.
hills and the mountains. I wasn't actually on the main island. So it was very disappointing. But what I find sad about the story of the Alala is the fact that, you know, it's such, as you say, an intelligent bird. And it makes you think we nearly lost it. we nearly lost something that we didn't realize anything about. And when you actually find out about it, you think, oh my God, it's so amazing that it can use tools and it's one of the brightest birds on two legs. Yet we
Mhm.
could have blindly lost it.
Yeah. And that, I mean, to me, one of the probably the first and major reason I wanted to write this book was because of the Alala, because I just fell in love with them, working with them. It was such an incredible experience to hear those forests just ringing with the Alala's voice. They had such a wild variety of different calls and incredible noises. At night, they would have these small whispering murmurations, just very different from their brash, loud calls during the day. But they were such a presence in that forest. And to me, it just was so tragic to think of them not being there. They were also captivating and just playful and like the condors. I think that's why I love these two species so much. They're both very intelligent, and you can really get to know personalities as you come to work with them. It's one of the sort of tragedies but silver linings of working with endangered species is that there's often not very many birds left, but you can come to know the individuals that are left really well. And I really appreciated how unique and different these different birds were. And I felt that by telling their stories, and sharing their personalities and the way they were, that I might get people to care about them. And I think when people care about individuals, they often then become aware and care more about the species and birds as a whole. So that was sort of my approach and hope in this book is to try to get people to know what these birds were really like, and it makes you realize how heartbreaking it is to be missing them.
Yeah, I think, you've done a very, very good job in the book, because it's made me think of them. And I know about birds and I didn't really think about them before. I mean,
Right.
I feel a bit sad at the moment because on social media, the big announcement is this week that the slender-billed curlew has been declared extinct. And it's a bird that used to breed in Siberia and winter around the Mediterranean and North Africa. And that just disappeared without even us noticing. We suddenly realized, hang on, where are they? They're gone.
Ugh,
Um,
heartbreaking.
it is. With the Hawaiian crow, with the yalala, obviously it's extinct in the wild. And that's due to avian malaria, isn't it? And is it habitat
Part of it,
destruction? Oh,
yeah, it's a lot was habitat loss, I think. Some avian malaria, the introduced predators took a big toll. But one of the things that they've really struggled with in reintroducing them is that the Hawaiian hawks have taken such a toll on the reintroduced birds. They've killed so many of the reintroduced birds. And that's been a real puzzle to people, because here was this native predator and there was a balance between the alala and its native predator for eons, but it's somehow been upended. Parts of that is habitat related because people introduced feral pigs and cattle and they destroyed the understory. And so the habitat's much more open. There's now rats and things like that Hawaiian hawks it's been sort of subsidizing the hawks so that they, can reproduce and do well. And so they've really targeted the reintroduced crows, and we don't know what it was about the crows in the past that were able to resist that kind of predation pressure more. So that's been a big sort of novel threat to them. But there is some great hope. The fact that they're at least going to try to reintroduce them on Maui in the hopes that they can bring it back enough and have it reproducing in the wild. And then my hope is that they'll be able to transfer some of those birds that are being successful. If they can transfer enough of them to the Big Island, maybe they can swamp or overwhelm the hawk pressure. But it's just there's so many complex factors going into the Hawaiian crow. But some of the crows at least were able to survive malaria, so that may have been less of an impact than was originally thought. But in terms of other birds in Hawaii, it's just decimated them.
it's,
So
it's a very sad story. Typical story of an island colonization and introduction
exactly.
of.
Yeah, exactly.
So the Hawaiian crow, how did it breed in captivity? Was it Did it breed well? Is it possible, do you think, in the long run to reintroduce it successfully?
I hope so. Condors bred really well in captivity, as did peregrine falcons, but it was a real struggle with the crow. I think the numbers went down to there were so few of them left, and uh, genetically they weren't as diverse, and so they had a lot of problems raised or breeding them in captivity. I mean, I forget what the numbers were, but for, some hundreds of eggs that were produced, only a small fraction would actually hatch and be successful. But they have succeeded. It's just taken decades. And as I said, there's been much less funding and interest. Like there's some Hawaiian biologists that just feel like they've banged their heads against the wall for 50 years trying to get people to pay attention to this species. But people are now paying attention and they have bred them in captivity, and there's about 120 or so in captivity now. So I think that part has been, if not resolved, it's more hopeful, and they're doing much better breeding in captivity than they were.
Yeah. Well, I guess the most successful story has been the Peregrine.
Mhm.
I don't know if you know, but I did a BBC World Service documentary on radio on the Peregrine,
Oh,
which
that's awesome.
yeah, came out in July, and I visited Kentucky, Madrid, and London talking
Oh,
about.
wow. I didn't know that. I'm gonna have to look it up.
And it was interesting because I learned a lot about the peregrine during that recording. I didn't realize that the birds in North America migrated so much because here in Europe, I mean, I always associate them just hanging out the whole time, local movements, but not the
Right.
major migrations that you've been speaking about in your book.
Right. Yeah, some of the peregrines are amazing. I mean, the peregrines that I reintroduced to Wyoming, their first winter, most of those first young birds would go only as far as Mexico or so, and then they would go farther south probably as they got older. But the peregrines that come from the tundra, the Arctic tundra portion of North America, they migrate all the way to southern Argentina and southern Chile. So it's a quite extraordinary migration that they make.
And the birds of the eastern seaboard, they obviously became extinct. Um,
Hmm.
I guess, well, I know that since then there's been a lot of reintroductions for birds from all over North America. So they've become, I guess, a hybrid. But in your presentation, you talked about hacking. Um, what's what do people feel about hacking? Because in the UK, for sure, there's a lot of conservationists or birders, even, should I say, who absolutely hate the idea of hacking, hate it. Is
Hmm.
there such backlash in the US?
No, not that I've ever heard of. What do they hate about it?
Well, for example, there's a species in England or in Britain. Well, actually, it's found in Europe, but the hen harrier,
Hmm.
that's been hunted to near extinction in England illegally by hunters
Mm.
and gamekeepers. And certain NGOs have talked about, hacking, taking some birds and bringing them up somewhere else and then releasing them back into their native area. For
Mhm.
some reason, people really hate that idea.
Yeah, I have never heard anyone have a problem with hacking in North America that I've heard of. It doesn't work with every species because some species, like the condor, needs a lot more help and encouragement. It's used to being dependent on its parents for much longer periods, whereas falcons figure things out instinctively, hunting wise, fairly quickly. So for peregrines, it was a wonderful solution and it worked incredibly well. So I don't know, maybe because we had such positive experience with it and peregrines were released all over North America. I mean, I think they released 7,000 peregrines in the US and Canada during the whole recovery period. So people seem to be pretty excited about it just because it had such enormous success with peregrines.
Yeah. I was quite surprised by the relatively small number of territories. when you think about it in the whole of North America. I mean, it's what but you said between 7 and 10,000 territories, which when I compare it to the UK, I think the UK's population now, because obviously it fell like yours during the DDT era and plus during World War II as well. But
Mhm.
we got about maybe 2,500 pairs in the UK, and UK isn't that big at
I
all.
know that is surprising. I mean, I think it may be that the cliffs and the types of buildings or high structures for nesting that we have are much more spread out. So a lot of our central US is plains country and flattish and doesn't have big cliffs or big cities, and those seem to be places that they target. So I think that's why we're more, it's a not uncommon species, but it's widespread enough that it's infrequently seen. It's always a big treat for a birder to get to see them. So I think it's funny, I think if you're in certain cities, you see them more often. I recently gave a talk in Chicago, and I was reading some of people's perspectives about peregrines in Chicago, and they were talking about it as well, now that it's mainly an urban bird. And I was stunned by that because I live in Rocky Mountain country, and for me, peregrines are up in these wild mountain canyons, and you have to hike up into them to get to see them. To me, they're a remote country bird, but it really depends on your perspective. And I think in North America, it is scattered, but they are around, especially cities and canyon areas, coastal cliffs, those sorts of places where there's structures for them to nest on.
Yeah, it's incredible that a lot of people think of them now as urban birds. I mean,
Mhm.
like you, when I first started seeing peregrines, I had to go places to see them, and even
Right,
if I was lucky, I wouldn't necessarily
right.
guarantee it. But then in some countries, like for example France, they're
Mhm.
barely an urban bird. I mean, I think they only started breeding in Paris not that long ago. So
Wow.
some areas that just haven't taken to the urban way of life at all.
Right.
Um,
I read that London was the second most dense urban population of peregrines after New York, which was something I hadn't known when I was looking up a few things before coming on and chatting with you. So it sounds like London is a good spot for them.
it is. I mean, when I did my show, I didn't realize myself that there's over 100 pairs in Greater London.
Crazy. That's
And
amazing.
for about 9 years, and I think it ended about 6 or 7 years ago, I used to stand on top of a tall building in central London during spring and fall to track migrating birds. And at any given time, we could see at least five peregrine territories from that
That's
lofty perch with
incredible.
London. It was,
Wow.
yeah, I mean, they were guaranteed every time we went up there.
That's
Um,
amazing. They're
DD.
a great species. They're a great gateway species to get
Oh,
people
absolutely.
into birds. I think showing them a peregrine often really hooks people. So
Yeah.
it's great to have that opportunity.
Yeah, it's funny because there used to be a pair that nested near the Tate Modern Museum in the heart of London, effectively. And I was invited because the RSPB, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, had a watch point there. And I was invited down one day to sort of, shake hands with people and stuff. But what I did was to bring an empty picture frame and I placed the picture frame on the prop and I got a telescope through the picture frame looking up onto the tower. And luckily there was a peregrine sitting there. And I called my piece Peregrinations. And
That's awesome.
I had a queue of people queuing up to look through the telescope and they offered me
That's
money to look through it.
great. That's excellent. That's amazing.
DDT, just as an aside, I don't know how to pronounce the actual full word. Do you? But it's
Um, I
definition.
um um I did, but I'm not getting it right now. I'm drawing a blank.
Okay, moving swiftly on.
Diphenyl yeah, I can't, I'm drawing a blank on it.
Yeah, I could never pronounce it. One more
When I
thing.
see it, I can pronounce it, but I can't remember offhand. We get so used to calling it DDT.
Yeah, exactly. Um, it's great that the peregrine's really increasing, and it's one of those, as you say, iconic birds. Pigeon fancying. is a issue in the UK. I know it's kind of declining a bit, but there's people out there who are adamant that, peregrines are killing their pigeons. And as you said in
Mhm.
your book, you've got birds, pigeons like tumblers that kind of flop around and fly down and look as if they're in distress and are a target for peregrines. Is pigeon fancying and the pigeon fanciers an issue in North America
I
for
think it
people?
has been. I don't know tons about it, but I know that in the past there have been, um, it is popular locally in certain places. I know some places in California it's very popular, and I remember reading some years ago about a lot of raptors that were killed by pigeon fanciers because they were worried about different raptors targeting their pigeons. And so there was a very big sort of bust of people who had been killing raptors. So it does happen, and people are still, upset about raptors killing their pigeons and targeting them. So that's still going on to some extent.
Yeah. What are you working on these days?
I am working on another book with a friend and colleague. We're creating an anthology of stories by and about women biologists. Um, she had gone into a bookstore years ago. She's a fisheries person and was looking for a book for a young female friend. And all the books were by men about men. And so she wanted to write an anthology that was all by women biologists. So we put out a request for stories, and we spent several years editing and working on stories that it will be a great collection. We're trying to find a publisher right now, but you know, playing with wolves in the Arctic, crashing in a helicopter, getting bitten by a bear in Yellowstone, just a wild variety of sort of the adventures that we have when we're out there in the field doing our work.
Is there much misogyny in the world of ecologists?
There is. I hope that it's changed. I hope it's better, but I had a rough go of it in a lot of the different elements of my career, like in graduate school and then after graduate school during the work, the projects that I worked on. So it was definitely it was really tough. So it was, in large part what led me to leaving the Condor project eventually were just the inequities that I was up against were really frustrating.
What is it about men? Why do men feel so possessive about things like this?
I don't know. That's a psychology question that is probably not one that I can answer tactfully. But there is definitely, I think sometimes with women biologists, they're very strong and very capable, and not everyone appreciates that, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I think when you produce that book, you better come back and we'll talk in more detail about
There were some interesting challenges in addition to my supervisors creating problems for me. It was always interesting sometimes the way my field crews operated. Some people were absolutely wonderful, but inevitably there were certain younger men on the project where I would say, we're going to do this and this today. And they had to challenge me on every single thing that I said. Why can't we do this? And, it was amazing. And I had a male colleague, and if I told him, go and tell them to do this, they said right away, okay, that sounds great. And they accepted things from him, and it was very different whenever I had to tell people what they needed to be doing. So that there were definitely challenges on different levels from the people that worked under me and also the people that worked over me. So you just have to navigate it all differently.
it's just a shame, a big shame. It's 2024 now, coming on 2025. We still are talking about this, and it's still
Yeah.
an issue.
Yeah. It's a waste of energy and talent, to have to spend time like that. So
What's your favorite bird?
that is such a tricky question. I knew you were going to ask that, and I think you have a favorite, but I have to say that it'd probably be easier to say which birds I didn't like with 10,000 birds to choose from. But among my favorites, because I have probably a dozen favorites at least, I love the birds that that I worked with and that I wrote about. And in part, it's because they were so smart and intelligent and had such captivating personalities. So I have to give those two. I also did my master's on the American dipper, which is like your
Love
Eurasian
that.
dipper.
Love
And
that.
they are such fun birds. They live in some of the most beautiful, my favorite places, mountain streams, and the way they can dive into these raging currents is just incredible. So I really love those. But then I also love two common birds that live on or around my house that I see all the time. One is the mountain bluebird, which is just spectacularly beautiful blue. And the other one is the opposite, very innocuous looking flycatcher, the Say's Phoebe. And they nest on my house. And so I think because I see them all day, every day, living out their lives, raising their young out my windows, I just really enjoy watching them and getting to know them. So those are probably some of my favorites. But if you asked, I might also say that I love almost every tropical bird because I love traveling the tropics and seeing some of their wild, colorful birds there too.
Okay, and that leads me on to the other question. If you could be anywhere in the world, where would you be right now?
Right now, I would probably be tropical birding, maybe in a cloud forest in Ecuador, Colombia, just looking at some of their wild, beautiful mannequins and different species that I love down there.
Good. Well, listen, it's been absolutely amazing chatting with you today. And I wish you all the success with Feather Trails. Um,
Thank you.
and yeah, thank you for giving us your time. And it's been really, it's a great read and you'll learn a lot. So please go and buy Sophie's book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And I'd like to thank the Zoomers here tonight as well for being here and actually supporting in conservation with. And remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and tell everyone about it. Okay. So until we meet again, keep looking up.